December 26th. I had just settled in with my morning coffee and extreme Sudoku when the phone rang. I always do one of the puzzles before work to stretch my brain, and I got so used to this exercise that I did it even on days when I wasn't working. You could say that solving puzzles is my profession. The group I work with receives suspicious computer code from various sources, and we have to figure out what it does, where it came from, and how to neutralize it. I like this kind of work. I'm a bit of a nerd and love solving puzzles. If someone wants to pay me for this, so much the better. In any case, my boss's name flashed on the display of my mobile phone. I cursed when I saw this. The last thing I wanted was a call from the office during the Christmas break. But when the boss calls, I answer. He was all about business, no, "Hi, how are you?" No wishes for Christmas or New Year. All he said was, "Thomas, I need you to come to the office now." "Seriously?" I moaned. "Today is the day after Christmas. This is a matter of national security, Thomas, so you need to move." I shook my head in disgust and scribbled a hasty note for Ginny so she would know where I was if she came home to find no one home. She went to see one of her friends who was going through a bad breakup. I thought it was too much for her, especially during the holidays, but that was Ginny, always looking out for her friends. This was one of the things that attracted me to her. After I wrote the note and put on my heavy coat, I got into my car and headed toward Baltimore Washington Park. What could be so important at this time of year, I thought, but when the boss says national security, you can't ask questions, and he probably wasn't exaggerating for effect. At least I didn't think so. You see, we work for the NSA, the National Security Agency, and we deal with national security issues all the time. As I headed toward Fort Meade, where the NSA is headquartered, I wondered if my boss's state of emergency was related to the project I was working on. 3 or 4 weeks ago, he sent me a very complex puzzle, a long piece of code that didn't seem to do anything. It looked like a worm, a nasty type of virus that infects computers and makes them do things you don't want them to do. But this code didn't react to anything we'd built it into, so we had no idea what it was supposed to do if it found its target. I love these types of puzzles. I love competing in intelligence with some hacker who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. He had deceived us so far, I must admit, but it seemed to me that we were getting closer to the solution, and soon we would reveal this code. When I cleared security, I was told to go straight to my boss's office, which rarely happened to me. When I got there, I found him talking in a low voice to his director. This was clearly not the usual scenario. Ben, my manager, was clearly worried about something. He hesitated for a moment, then looked at his director and shrugged. Turning to me, he said, "Thomas, there's no easy way to say this, so I'll just say it straight. Your wife is cheating on you." I had no idea why he called me. This message was the last thing I could imagine, and it felt like a knife stabbing into my chest. "No," I shouted, jumping to my feet. "That's a lie. How can you say such terrible things?" He leaned back from his desk when I stood up, but realizing that I had no intention of attacking him, he sat back down in his chair and looked to the director for help. The director stood up and began to walk behind Ben. "Thomas, I know this is shocking, but it happens all the time. You have to accept it like a man." "No, I shouldn't," I said angrily, "because it's not true. You're wrong, you made a mistake." They looked at each other and the director shrugged. "We didn't want to go into lurid detail, but there seems to be no other way to convince you." He signaled to Ben, who began running the file on his computer. The director continued, "This call was recorded before Christmas, but due to the holidays, we didn't have time to analyze it until this morning. After we heard it, Ben called you to come." He nodded to Ben, who prepared the file for playback. Then he looked at me again. "You better sit down to hear it." Ben clicked on the mouse and Ginny's voice filled the room. Between the quality of the mobile phone she was using and the playback on the computer, the sound quality was not great, but there was no doubt whose voice I was listening to. "I hate that we can't be together these 2 days," she said in a tone I hadn't heard in a long time. "What's wrong, baby? Didn't I give you enough love last time?" asked a male voice. "No, never," she said passionately. "Making love to you backfires. Every time you do it, I want it even more. You're like an addiction to me." For a moment, I thought I was going to get sick. Ben gave me a worried look and motioned to turn off the recording. But I shrugged it off. I should have heard it. The man's laughter on the recording shocked and angered me. "When can we be together again?" he asked. "Well, definitely not for Christmas," said Ginny, "but I'll find a way to get out of the house the next day. I'll tell Thomas that my friend is depressed and needs reassurance. That always works for him." This little revelation made me gnash my teeth. "What would you like me to do with you if we could be together now?" the man asked playfully. Ginny's voice became more hoarse. "If you were here now, I would like you to play with my breasts. And then, oh baby, I'd like you to have sex with me." "Turn it off," I shouted, startling Ben. Listening to her talk like some sex-crazed bitch to another man was more than I could handle. My Ginny, the woman I loved and worshipped, betrayed me. Without this recording, I would never have believed it. Hearing this in front of my boss and his director made it all the more humiliating. I closed my eyes, wanting to hide under the table. Ben looked at me with concern. "Are you okay, Thomas? Is there anything I can do to help you?" "No," I said quietly, shaking my head, still trying to process what I had just learned. "Just give me a minute, I'll be fine." Then a thought flashed through my mind and my pain turned to anger. "Wait a minute. What were you doing wiretapping my wife? You had no right to do that." The director stepped forward, raising his hands as if to calm him down. "It's not that simple, Thomas." I interrupted him. "Yes, it's simple. You were spying on my wife. She's a citizen and doesn't even work for the government. You had no right to do that." "Thomas, we weren't following Ginny. Our computer detected a voice recording of her, partner, and that's why we captured the conversation." I looked at him and shook my head in confusion. The director ran his hand through his graying hair. "Thomas, I don't know how to say this, but your wife's lover is on our terrorist list. We think he's an Al-Qaeda or ISIS operative. It's hard to tell the two apart these days." I thought I had already received the worst shock of my life. Now I realized that it was premature. "Ginny may be a cheater, but she's not a terrorist," I wheezed. "She would never help these people." When news broke about the latest terrorist attack, she was outraged. We talked about it several times. "Calm down, Thomas. No one thinks Ginny is directly connected to any terrorist organization. We think this guy is targeting her." At first, I felt some relief. It's not Ginny's fault. Some Middle Eastern James Bond decided to seduce her. But I couldn't help but think that she had given in to him. Why is she dating this guy? Why is she flirting with anyone other than me? I thought we had a strong marriage. When did she stop loving me? But I put that question aside to try to understand everything else I had just been told. I don't understand why would some terrorist group target Ginny. It doesn't make sense. Ben squeezed my shoulder. "Think about it, Thomas. They don't want Ginny. They want to use her to get closer to you." "To me? Why would anyone want to get close to me?" "We can't be sure, but we think they want to use Ginny to get to you and use you to get information about the NSA. That's the only thing that makes sense." I collapsed into a chair and lazily looked around the office, as if there was something there that could help me understand this madness. I noticed a Christmas wreath hanging on Ben's window, and the view struck me as incongruous. Christmas was now a thing of the past in many ways. I didn't think I would ever experience peace on earth, goodwill toward men again. Ben's director placed both hands on the table and leaned over to look at me closely. "Thomas, I have an important question to ask you." I looked at him blankly. "Thomas, can you meet with Ginny tonight and pretend nothing happened? Can you act like you didn't find out?" I looked at him like he was crazy. "No way," I said firmly. He glanced at Ben. "That's what I thought," he said. "I know I couldn't if the situation was reversed. So here's what we'll do. We'll send you out of town for a few days to get you out of harm's way until we figure out what exactly is going on." "What is the problem?" I asked hotly. "Just catch the bastard and interrogate him. If you need someone to torture, I'll be happy to volunteer," I added. They looked at each other. "The point is, Thomas, Amir has disappeared and may have left Washington. Either way, his cell phone signal is gone, and he's not in the apartment where he lived." It dawned on me, and after everything I had learned, it seemed strange to ask, but I asked anyway. "What about Ginny? Is she in danger?" "I don't think so," said the director. "She wasn't Amir's real target, only a means to an end. But don't worry, the FBI will be keeping a close eye on her." I felt a little relieved. What Ginny did left a gaping hole in me, but I still couldn't want anything to happen to her. I've been taking care of her for too long. I just couldn't turn off these feelings so quickly. I looked at the two men. "So what should I do now?" "You need to return home immediately to pack your things. Then immediately go to Washington National Airport. We will fly you to Oak Ridge. The reservation has already been made," the director said. "The first available flight is a Southwest flight to Nashville at noon. We will send someone to meet you at the airport and take you to Oak Ridge." Trying to make sense of this, the director added, "Be sure to leave a note for Ginny so she won't get suspicious in case Amir contacts her again." When I returned home to our small house and began to pack my things, everything seemed to have changed. All the furniture and decor that had been cozy and familiar in the morning now felt foreign. Our home was filled with dreams and aspirations for me. Now none of this remains. When I wrote the note to Ginny, it took all my self-control not to say what was in my heart. But I remembered what I had been told about her lover, and the last thing I wanted to do was warn him that we were on to him. So I left a simple and direct message and didn't make a dramatic gesture like leaving a wedding ring on the note. But I still took off the ring and put it in my pocket. The connection it symbolized was severed the moment I heard this recording. During the 2-hour flight, I tried to distract myself by solving Sudoku in the magazine on board, but I couldn't concentrate. My hand constantly reached into my pocket to feel for the ring lying there. If only there was a magic ring that could take you back in time to before all this started. But then I remembered that whatever the reason or vulnerability that led Ginny to cheat, it would still be there, ready to arise at the next opportunity. Hell, I was so depressed that I couldn't even come up with a normal fantasy. As I stepped off the ramp at Nashville International Airport, a very large man with a noticeable bulge under his jacket approached me and asked, "Are you Thomas Selfridge?" I started to answer, but realized that I didn't know who this guy was. "Do you have an ID?" I asked. He sighed, pulled out his wallet, and showed his FBI badge. I nodded and followed him. "How did you know it was me?" I asked. "I was told to look for the saddest guy on the plane," he said without smiling. I followed him, depressed by the thought that my trouble was obvious to everyone. I didn't get to see your name on the badge," I said, trying to be at least a little sociable. "Henry," he said, continuing down the hallway. Is Henry your first or last name?" I asked, trying to catch up with him. "Yes," he said, still walking. I shook my head. Between my melancholy and Henry's silence, the trip to Oak Ridge promised to be real hard labor, I thought wistfully. I looked at the map at the airport before departure and knew that Oak Ridge is just over 150 miles almost due east of Nashville on I-40. This meant we had a 2-hour drive ahead of us. As I expected, Henry was silent most of the way. But as we passed the Harriman exit, he suddenly pushed me and nodded to the left. I looked up and did a double take. There, rising above the low ridges and trees, stood two of the largest smokestacks I had ever seen. Even with the winter shadows darkening the surroundings, the towers were still tall enough to catch the light. The view was surreal, almost like something out of a De Chirico painting. "What is this?" I asked. "Kingston Steam Power Plant," Henry said. "It produces 1.7 gigawatts of power, most of which goes to your guys at the NSA and Oak Ridge National Laboratory." We drove over the bridge, and now I could see the entire structure. How tall are these things? I asked. A little over 1,000 feet, he said, higher than the Eiffel Tower. As I was digesting this, I suddenly realized that this was the longest conversation Henry and I had had on the entire trip. How do you know so much about this? I asked. He looked at me. I grew up in this area, he said. He then suddenly turned off the interstate onto Route 58 and headed north toward Oak Ridge. Soon after, he turned into the parking lot of a roadside motel. It's too late for visits tonight, he said. We'll stop here. He noticed my skeptical look. Don't worry. The rooms are small but clean, he said. Great, I thought. A terrible day just got worse. December 27th. In fact, the motel was more comfortable than I expected, and the breakfast they served the next morning was delicious. I had never eaten grits before, but to my surprise, I liked them. After breakfast, we got back in the car and headed to the gates of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Even though we were on the list of approved visitors, security was still very tight. The NSA's Oak Ridge operation is called the Multipurpose Research Facility, but everyone just calls it Building 5300. The team in Building 5300 primarily focuses on code breaking. In today's world, this means using maximum computing power to decrypt data until it gives up and reveals its secrets. My specialty is different. I analyze computer software of unknown origin and either destroy it or neutralize it. The Oak Ridge guys specialize in transcription, so I haven't had much dealings with them in the past. But when they started showing me their toys, the ideas started flowing. In a nutshell, Building 5300 contains perhaps the largest and fastest computer in the world. It's so massive that it takes up an area the size of a warehouse and requires enormous cooling capacity to keep it from overheating. And yes, he is fast. The current version of their brainchild is an exascale computer, which means it can perform 10 to the 18th power of calculations per second. Even encryption with 128-bit keys cannot withstand such pressure. I was intrigued by the idea of using this kind of power to fight viruses, worms, and Trojan horses. The hackers who write this have their own style, their own way of solving problems. It occurred to me that maybe we could tell who wrote the malicious code by the way it was written. I understand. It's like a linguist can determine the origin of a text by choice of words, spelling, and phrases, the chief technician said excitedly. All we need is enough samples to identify patterns and trends. I was very pleased with myself about the idea and promised to present it to my superior as soon as I returned to Fort Meade. Businesses and governments are facing an increasing number of cyberattacks. This could be a way to determine who launched the attack and where it came from. Just then, I heard a thud behind me and turned around to see Henry looking at his watch. He had patiently and silently followed me all day, and now he clearly made it clear that the workday was over. I checked my phone and was surprised how late it was. That evening, Henry drove me into the town of Oak Ridge and took me to Dean's restaurant for dinner. The place didn't look like much, a converted drugstore, but the fried catfish Henry ordered was delicious. I might as well become a Southerner if everything here is so delicious, I told him. He just chuckled. When I got back to the motel room, I turned on my cell phone and found that I had a voicemail from Ginny. My sudden business trip was unusual, and she was both surprised and annoyed, especially since I didn't say when I'd be back. I guess I'm making it difficult for her to arrange her next meeting with Amir, I thought bitterly, and was about to delete the message. Instead, I listened to it again to listen more closely to her voice. It was strange. Her voice sounded the same as always, but I couldn't help but hear the lecherous tone she used with her lover. How could she be so recognizable and so unfamiliar at the same time? Finally, I turned off the phone and threw myself on the bed. As I lay there, I continued to remember scenes from our life together. Suddenly, I remembered how Ginny came home all upset because her best friend caught her husband cheating on her. I told her to kick that scoundrel out and get a hot lawyer to put him out of business, she said vindictively. If he didn't want to stay married, he could have at least filed for divorce. He didn't have to cheat. Although I agreed with Ginny's assessment, I was somewhat surprised by her furious reaction. But at least I had confidence in my marriage, because it was obvious that Ginny would never cheat on me. What a fool you were, I cursed myself. What a hypocrite she is. December 28th. After breakfast, I was to go on a tour of the Y12 complex. That's where the bomb was made, and it's in another part of the area. I never realized how big the Oak Ridge area is. Henry drove me through hills and forests where there was not a soul, and suddenly we found ourselves at an industrial complex the size of a small city. In Building 5300, I was among people from my agency, and we could talk about business. At Y12, I was just another visitor, and quickly realized that my guide thought I was wasting his time. Besides, I felt the same way. I understood that my boss wanted to keep me away so that I would not let Ginny and Amir know that we had contacted them. But surely I could be doing something more interesting than wandering around a classified nuclear production complex. Plus, I hated nuclear weapons and didn't want to be around them any more than absolutely necessary. When midday came, I approached Henry and asked if there was anything we could do other than follow the board guide. An expression appeared on Henry's face that could have been a smile. We apologized to the guide, and Henry led me into his car and drove me to another local eatery off-site. Over lunch, I asked him if there was anything interesting in the area. "Of course," he said. "There's some pretty beautiful nature around here about half an hour away if you're willing to get off the main roads." It sounded appealing. Most anything would have been at that point, so I enthusiastically agreed. Accordingly, after lunch, I found myself driving northwest from Oak Ridge to Frozen Head State Park. When I asked Henry about the strange name, he said it came from the main peak, which is often covered in snow during the colder months of the year. We were already driving along the old state road when we turned north to the small town of Petros, where the entrance to the park is located. Once we reached the park, our car began to climb, and the highway became a series of switchbacks that snaked up the side of Fork Mountain. The posted speed limit was 10 miles per hour, and given the icy conditions and sharp turns, I thought even that was excessive. The park was mostly filled with deciduous trees, and without foliage to obscure the view, the scenery was spectacular. Henry kept pointing them out every time we approached the viewpoint, so maybe that's why he didn't notice the SUV that caught up to us and started passing us. But he did not overtake us, but suddenly crashed into the side of our car. "Son of a bitch!" Henry shouted and jerked the steering wheel to the right, but the other car continued driving with us and crashed into us again. As our wheels left the asphalt, Henry tried to hold the steering wheel, and for a moment I thought he could handle it. Then the world turned upside down as our car flipped and tumbled. When the view through the windshield finally stabilized, we were on our backs like an upside-down turtle, and I was hanging weakly upside down, held in place by the seat belt. Movement ahead caught my attention, and I struggled to understand what I was seeing. A moment later, I saw the SUV that hit us enter the start of the Jeep trail ahead, then back up and turn around. "He's coming back to finish us off," I shouted. Henry was still cursing and trying to free the large machine gun he was carrying. As the SUV began to accelerate toward us, a second car sped past us like a mad moonshiner and headed straight for the SUV. Instinctively, I closed my eyes, expecting a terrible collision, but at the last moment, the driver of the SUV must have gotten scared and jerked the steering wheel to avoid the collision. I think he lost control because the SUV flipped over and rolled down the ravine. I didn't see what happened, but I heard the noise of the car rubbing against the rocks and then crashing into the huge trees below. The second vehicle came to an abrupt stop near the point where the SUV overturned. Then the figure ran towards us, and to my surprise, I realized that it was a woman. She was wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and high boots, and her dark hair was cut short and combed back. But I stopped admiring her when I noticed the fierce combat knife in her hand. "Now she's coming for us," I thought, and continued to fight for freedom. The woman ran to Henry's side, knelt down, and reached through the broken window to cut the seat belt. When Henry climbed out the window, she walked around to my side of the car and prepared to cut my belt too. "You better hold on to something," she said in a slightly accented voice, "or you'll fall on your head." I grabbed the car seat, but still landed awkwardly when she cut the belt. She started to pull me out of the car, but suddenly jerked back, noticing something. I looked up and saw Henry disappearing behind the ravine where the SUV had crashed. "No, come back!" The woman screamed and rushed after Henry. "Get out of there!" she shouted, trying to get Henry's attention. As she approached the ravine, I heard a strange voice shouting something that sounded like Los Angeles. Then there was a deafening explosion, and the woman was knocked off her feet by the shock wave. I managed to get out of the car and run up to her. As I helped her up, I asked, "What was that?" Her face took on a gloomy expression. "They call it a martyr's vest. Now everyone wears them." I wasn't sure what she meant, but suddenly I remembered my companion. "Henry," I shouted and ran towards the ravine, but the woman grabbed my hand. "If you don't have combat experience, it's better not to go there and not look at it. I'm sorry, but your friend died." She shook her head angrily. "Aren't you briefed on what to expect?" I still didn't understand what she was talking about, but when she pulled my hand, I obediently followed her to her car. "What are we going to do with Henry?" I asked as she started the engine. "I need to tell someone what happened to him." She shook her head angrily. "The only thing we need now is to get out of here. They may have sent a second team." "Who sent the second team?" I asked, fastening my seatbelt. "ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whoever. For us now, there is no difference. They want to kill you, and I need to make sure that doesn't happen." Involuntarily, I looked over my shoulder, but no one was following us. Then it dawned on me that Henry and the woman must have been working together. I turned to her and said, "Sorry about your partner." "Which partner?" she asked, puzzled. "Henry is the guy who blew up there." "He wasn't my partner. I'm not from the FBI." Now I was really confused. "But if you're not from the FBI, then who are you?" She glanced at me briefly before looking back at the road. "I'm from the Mossad," she said quietly. I stared at her. "Israeli intelligence agency. What does the Mossad want from me?" I demanded an answer. Her lips pressed into a thin, straight line. "We're trying to save your ass right now," she said as the car slid around a sharp turn. I leaned back in my seat, unable to understand what was happening. As I sat there trying to process what was happening, I noticed that we had left the park and appeared to be heading back toward I-40. Now that we weren't hurtling around tight turns, I thought I'd try to get some answers. "Okay, I really appreciate you saving my life back there. I don't even know your name." She looked at me again, and a small smile appeared on her face. "I'm Esther Freeman," she said. "Nice to meet you, Thomas Selfridge." We were already on the interstate, heading east toward Oak Ridge. I watched as she set the cruise control 5 miles too high. The shock of what had happened began to wear off, leaving behind only confusion. Why are Arab terrorists trying to kill me? Why is a Mossad agent protecting me? What should I do now? What the hell is going on? I looked at her in bewilderment. "I guess I don't understand. Shouldn't we call the police or the FBI and tell them what happened there?" She gave me a dark look. "You still don't understand, do you? Why do you think that guy was waiting for you?" "I don't know," I said helplessly. "Just 2 days ago, I was at Fort. That is, in Washington, and then I was ordered to go here to Oak Ridge. I don't know how they knew I was here or why they wanted to kill me." "You don't have to be secretive with me," she said. "I know you work for the NSA. I also know why your boss ordered you to come here urgently." I tensed up. "You mean you know about Ginny and—" She nodded. "We've known about her little affair with Amir for some time now. I heard the recording of your wife's conversation and several others." I grimaced involuntarily. It's bad enough when your wife cheats on you. It's much worse when you find out that everyone knows about it. With an angry tone, I said, "That still doesn't explain why I was attacked." She took a deep breath. "Didn't you find it strange that your boss sent you out of town so suddenly?" she asked. Did you find it strange that they wanted you to tell Ginny where you were going? They were trying to keep me from running into her, I said hotly. She shook her head as if I was a slow learner in her class. They were trying to use you as bait to lure Amir away from Fort Meade, she said. They wanted him to follow you. They didn't know what he was up to, and they wanted him to be as far away from the NSA as possible. They probably also thought that if he followed you, Henry could take him out. But Henry was careless when he took you to Frozen Head and managed to die in the process. They used me as bait? I asked, becoming angrier at the thought. But before I could think about it any further, I noticed that we had passed the first exit for Oak Ridge. We shouldn't have gone there, I asked. She shook her head. This is the last place we want to go now. We need to get you back to Fort Meade. I tried to wrap my head around this idea. Are we going to fly out of Knoxville? She shook her head. No planes, no credit cards, no cell phone calls. I can't risk another interception attempt. We're getting off the grid. Are we going to drive all the way to Washington? I asked incredulously. She simply nodded. We were caught in rush hour in Knoxville, and I remained silent as Esther maneuvered through traffic. But as soon as we passed them and headed for the Virginia border, I could no longer hold back my questions. You never said why the Mossad was watching me, I complained. Besides, you didn't say why Al-Qaeda or whoever is with Amir is trying to kill me. Suddenly, I had an unpleasant thought. Wait, did Amir blow himself up with Henry? She shook her head. Not so lucky. It was actually Amir's brother Hassan. He was a bad guy too, and I'm not sorry he's gone, but Amir is the one we really want, preferably alive. Considering Amir slept with my wife, I wouldn't mind if he ended up in pieces there. So who is this Amir, and why does he want to kill me? She took on a clearly uncomfortable expression. Actually, it might be partly our fault. You know that computer virus you've been working on for the last few weeks? Well, we're the ones who sent it to the NSA. I was stunned that she knew about this. Is there anything else left secret? One of our people found him attached to a message that we intercepted in Tel Aviv. We haven't been able to figure out what it is or what it is for, but we think its destination is in Israel. The only clue we have is what appears to be the name of the virus, Al-Andalus. This was the first time I heard about the name. What is Al-Andalus? I asked. Is this some kind of code or someone's name? No, it's a name from history. In the 700s, the Moors invaded Europe from North Africa. Over time, they managed to conquer Portugal, most of Spain, and even parts of France. They called the region Al-Andalus, and various caliphates and emirates ruled them for the next 7 centuries. I looked at her, stunned. Is this all because of something that happened 1,300 years ago? She nodded grimly. I know it's hard to believe, but ISIS wants to restore the caliphate and return Muslim rule to Al-Andalus. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard, I exclaimed. How can they hope for that? And anyway, it has nothing to do with me. I don't have Spanish blood. I've never even been to Spain. You're looking at it from a Western point of view, not theirs, she said calmly. For ISIS, the loss of Al-Andalus was a humiliation that must be avenged, and they are ready for a fight that could last for centuries. They know they need the support of other Arab countries, so their plan is to unite them by attacking the State of Israel. We think the Al-Andalus virus is the beginning of this campaign. Our experts believe that this virus is a very sophisticated cyberattack on our defenses, but we were unable to crack it, so we handed it over to you. Why me? I'm just another hacker. I'm nothing special, I said. Don't underestimate yourself, Esther said. We have watched your work, and we know what you are capable of. More importantly, ISIS knows this too, and they desperately want to make sure that no one can neutralize their virus. Why do you think they tried to contact you through Ginny? Why do you think Amir sent his brother after you when you were suddenly sent to the largest and fastest computer system in the country? My boss never said anything about this, I protested. She shook her head in disgust. NSA management was never convinced that the Al-Andalus virus was that important, she said. We should have insisted that it be assigned to you. Suddenly, I remembered. Just before this guy blew himself up, he screamed something I didn't understand. She immediately understood what I was talking about. Yes, he shouted, Al-Andalus. Do you believe me now? I sat back in my chair and tried to process everything I had just learned. Another question came to mind, but before I could ask it, Esther turned sharply onto the Johnson City exit. Where are you driving? I asked, but instead of answering, she pulled over to the side of the road and turned off the engine. Then her head dropped onto the headrest. I don't think I can go any further, she said, and to my horror, she fainted. I think I panicked a little because I screamed at her and shook her, but she didn't wake up. I got out of the car, ran around to the driver's side, and opened the door. Then I saw the problem. The left shoulder of the leather jacket she was wearing had a torn hole. I pulled her out from behind the wheel and tried to get her into the back seat. Now what to do? I saw a motel sign in the distance, and not knowing what else to do, I drove there. An elderly man was working at the front desk, and remembering what Esther said, I paid cash for the room for the night. When I returned to the car, I found Esther sitting in the back seat. She nodded approvingly when she saw my room key, which made me feel better. I drove up to the room and carefully helped her get out of the car and walk to the bed. She groaned as she lay down, but otherwise was as stoic as a Spartan. When I turned on the bedside lamp, she looked at me. You need to help me take off this jacket, she said. I nodded and helped her pull her good arm out of her sleeve, then carefully released her injured arm. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Okay, now we need to take off the sweater. I swallowed because the jersey was thick, and I knew it wouldn't come off as easily as the jacket. Gently, I pulled the torn sleeve of the sweater off, and she sobbed quietly as her hand was freed. I also tried not to look at her body, but it was not easy. She had an athletic body with well-developed abdominal muscles and almost no fat. She was wearing a sports bra, but it was still obvious that she was well-built. I looked up and saw a small smile on her lips. A girl always appreciates a look from a guy, she said as I blushed. Then her smile disappeared and she became businesslike. You should see if there's a pharmacy near here. If you find one, try to buy ibuprofen, isopropyl alcohol, a tube of antibiotic, gauze bandages, and duct tape. Oh, and get one of those little sewing kits if they have them. I rushed to the car, wanting to avoid further embarrassment in front of Esther. At a small shopping center about a mile from the motel, I was able to buy everything I needed. I remembered to pay everything in cash. When I returned to the room, Esther was sitting on the bed. It looks like she managed to clean the wound in the bathroom. She first took a few ibuprofen tablets, then told me to clean and rinse the wound with alcohol. I knew it must hurt, but she didn't make a sound. When I cleaned the wound as best I could, she looked at me and said, "Give me my knife." I didn't understand why she needed a combat knife, but I took it out of her pocket and handed it to her. "Now I need you to stitch the wound," she said. "Wait a minute," I protested. "I've never done anything like this. I don't know how." Reluctantly, I threaded the needle and tied a knot at the end. When it was ready, she took the knife, put the handle in her mouth, and bit the rubber handle. Swallowing, I began to stitch the wound. Once I had tied the knot, I applied antibiotics to the wound. She spat out the knife and looked at my makeshift stitch. "Not bad for a newbie," she said and fainted. This scared me, but her breathing and pulse were normal. I laid her on her back and used a spare pillow to elevate her legs. Then I covered her with a blanket and waited. After a few minutes, her eyes opened. When she saw me, a small smile appeared on her lips. "Don't worry, Thomas, I'm fine now. I just feel really weak. Let me get some sleep and I'll be fine." Then she closed her eyes. When Esther's breathing indicated that she had fallen asleep again, a wave of fatigue washed over me. The assassination attempt, Henry's death, the revelations I've heard, and now my impromptu operation on Esther have all drained my strength. I stood up and turned off the light in our room, then sat down, took off my shoes, and threw my keys and wallet on the nightstand. I couldn't sleep on the floor, so I lay down next to Esther. I fell asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. December 29th. The sky was light when I woke up, and I was ashamed to find that I had embraced Esther with my hand on her waist. I carefully removed my hand, hoping not to wake her. I didn't want her to misunderstand me. She still seemed to be sleeping, so I put on my boots, grabbed my wallet and keys, and went out to the car to find some food. Luckily, there was a fast food place next to the pharmacy I found the night before, and I was able to buy a bag of lunches and a couple of large coffees. When I returned to our motel, Esther was already awake and sitting on the bed. At her request, I changed the bandage on her arm. Then I had to help her put on her sweater. I tried to remain indifferent, being so close to the barely dressed girl, but it was not easy. Luckily, I didn't do anything to offend or hurt her. Esther and I were both hungry and grabbed sandwiches. We were sipping coffee when she looked at me curiously and said, "I didn't know Ginny had a tattoo." "She doesn't," I answered. "What made you think that?" "I woke up at night and went to the bathroom. When I returned, I noticed that your wallet fell and her photo fell out of it. Looks like she had a tattoo on her neck." My depression returned with a vengeance. "It's an old photograph," I said dryly, "and it's not a tattoo, it's a port wine stain." Esther must have caught my tone because she raised her eyebrows and asked, "Do you want to tell me about it?" Ginny and I went to the same school. She was smart, pretty, and slim, and I was crazy about her. But I was shy and passionate about science, so I never dared to ask her out. Plus, Ginny was born with a port wine stain on her neck. She was very embarrassed about it, and unfortunately, the other children teased her mercilessly. One day, I was walking down the corridor and saw a group of children surrounding her and teasing her. Jelly Ginny was what they called her birthmark, and it must have hurt her because she was crying. Suddenly, I ran as fast as I could and stood in front of them, clenching my fists and blushing with anger. "Get away from her," I screamed with all my might. "Leave her alone. She's beautiful, and you're just too stupid to understand it." Any of the guys could have smashed me all over the floor if they wanted, but I was so furious that I didn't care, and that must have scared them. Finally, one of the girls at the edge of the group pulled the guy by the hand and said, "Let's go, let's leave her," and suddenly the small group of pursuers dispersed. I turned to Ginny, who was looking at all this through tear-stained eyes. "Let's go," I said. "Let's skip class and go outside for a while." I took her to the football field, and we climbed into the stands. "Why did you say that, Thomas?" she asked, uncertainty. "Why did you say that I am beautiful?" "Because you are beautiful, Ginny," I said sincerely. "You think your birthmark makes you ugly, but I think it makes you unique and special." "But it's ugly," she insisted. "I see him every day in the mirror, and I hate him." "You're wrong," I insisted. "You look at yourself and see only a spot. I look at you and see a beautiful, special girl. You focus on your birthmark, but I see the whole of you." She looked at me in surprise and then suddenly leaned down and kissed me on the lips. This is how our relationship began. We graduated from college together and got married after graduation. But the thing is, Ginny never really believed that she was beautiful. That mark on her neck was always on her mind, and she kept trying to hide it with makeup or the clothes she wore. Anyway, after we graduated and she got a job, she wanted to use her income to remove a port wine stain. I loved her for who she was, but she was determined and went to a specialist to explore the possibility of laser treatment. The doctor told her the good news that the procedures were indeed effective and could virtually eliminate the birthmark. But he also had bad news. He told her it would take 8 to 10 treatments to see results, and that she would have to wait several months between treatments to allow the skin to heal. The other bad news was the cost, which wasn't cheap and wasn't covered by insurance. But Ginny was so excited about the prospect of getting rid of her stain that nothing else mattered to her. Anyway, Ginny completed the treatments about a year ago, and it has completely changed her outlook on life. Her self-confidence increased, and she became more flirtatious and outgoing. She also started wearing more revealing clothes now that she didn't have to hide the spot on her shoulder and neck. Of course, this began to attract the attention of other men. I didn't like it, but Ginny loved it. She said that she liked to be looked at with admiration rather than pity. Her new behavior bothered me, but when I tried to say something, she accused me of not letting her enjoy her life. I was happy for Ginny that she was happy, so I kept my doubts to myself. You know what this led to. Esther looked at me for a long time in silence, and I thought that she considered me a complete weakling. Instead, she finally said, "You are an interesting person, Thomas. You are not at all what I imagined you to be." Then she stood up abruptly. "We need to get back on track. The morning is almost over, and we have a long way to go." Although Esther said that her hand was better, she was still uncomfortable driving, so I took the wheel again. We soon left Tennessee and crossed the border into Virginia, but we still had about 8 hours to drive. As we drove north on I-81, I glanced at Esther. "What do you know about the Al-Andalus virus? Why are your people so worried about him?" I asked her. Now she was all business. "Our people have been working on it since we discovered it, but there has been no progress. At first, they thought it was some kind of routine collection of information, something to steal passwords, secret documents, confidential data. But the problem is that the damn thing doesn't do anything. We isolated different types of computers and infected them with this virus. The virus runs for a moment, then shuts down." "Then why are you so worried?" I asked. "For 3 reasons," she said. "Firstly, our people have never seen anything like this. It seems to be very complex and highly developed. No one would go to such trouble for something harmless. The second reason is that we are picking up all sorts of hidden activity from ISIS. Everything we hear indicates that something big is about to happen, we just don't know what or when. And finally, there is you." I said in surprise. "Exactly," she said. "When we sent this virus to you, the noise level peaked and then dropped sharply. Then, the next moment, we found out that 2 very bad guys were following you." "Amir and his brother," I said bitterly. "Exactly," she said. "When you put it all together, it becomes clear that whatever Al-Andalus is, it is critical to ISIS's plans. We must find out his purpose and how to stop him. So when we get back to Washington, we should go straight to Fort Meade?" I asked. Esther shook her head decisively. "I really doubt they'll let me in there with you," she said, "and they might not even let you in after what happened at Oak Ridge. Rather than risk a long delay, I think it would be better if you deal with the virus from your home computer. You have secure access to the NSA network, right?" I said yes, and that became our plan. The only thing I didn't like about working from home was the opportunity to meet Ginny. After everything I had learned, I just wasn't ready to confront her. Besides, it would only distract me from the virus. I'll have to deal with my wife later. I tried to make up for our late start, but we kept losing time on the way. Besides the inevitable restroom stops and lunch breaks, the wound on Esther's arm was clearly causing her more pain than ibuprofen could relieve. Finally, I turned off the interstate in Harrisonburg and went looking for a pharmacy. I walked past a couple of chain stores and finally found an old-fashioned family drugstore. The pharmacist on duty was a woman, and when I showed her Esther's hand, she became very sympathetic. "I'm trying to get my wife to our family doctor in Washington," I said, "but I don't know if she can hold out until we get there." The woman returned to the shelves and appeared with a small white envelope. "Here is Lortab," she told me. "It's a combination of acetaminophen and hydrocodone. I can't give you more than 1 pill without a prescription, but it should help your wife until you get home. I recommend that she eat something before taking it." I thanked the pharmacist profusely for her kindness, and we got back into the car. Esther wanted to wait a little while before taking the medicine so it wouldn't make her drowsy, so I drove for another hour until we reached the I-66 exit and stopped at Front Royal. By then, it was after 8 p.m., and we were both hungry. We found a fun little cafe called Spelunker's, probably because of the Skyline Caverns, and ate burgers and fries there, which were surprisingly good. Esther took Lortab with food, and it seemed to have an immediate effect on her, because she began to fall asleep immediately after eating. I was exhausted too, so it was obvious that we wouldn't make it home that night. There was a Super 8 motel almost right across the street, so after eating, I drove there and got us a room. I helped Esther inside, and she fell asleep within minutes of getting into bed. I could only sit in the dark room, and again my thoughts began to return to everything that had happened. In just a few days, my whole life turned upside down, and the person who caused all this chaos was none other than my wife Ginny, the woman I loved unconditionally and for whom I was willing to sacrifice my life before all of this. Betrayal, I thought, must be the worst sin. When you love and trust someone and then discover that they are not as loyal, it shakes you to the core. I felt so many emotions that I couldn't even identify them all. The only thing I knew for sure was that Ginny was the last person I wanted to see. The more I thought about the possibility of meeting her, the more worried I became until I did something I shouldn't have done. I went outside, turned on my cell phone and called Ginny, hoping she wouldn't answer. Of course, the call went to her voicemail, and upon hearing her recorded message, my emotions quickly reached boiling point. "It's me, Ginny," I said, trying not to yell at her. "Listen, I know everything about you, about your affair with Amir. I heard what you wanted to do with him when you were stuck at home with me, and it made me sick. I can't believe that you betrayed me like that after everything I did for you, and especially after all those words about loyalty." I realized my voice was rising and took a deep breath to calm myself. "Anyway, I'll be home tomorrow and I don't want you there. Go to your boyfriend, go to your parents, or go to hell, I don't care. Just stay away from our house because the only time I want to see you again is in the divorce courtroom." I wanted to say more, something to convey all the pain and anger I felt, but I couldn't think of anything smart, so I hung up. At that moment, I wished I had an old telephone with a receiver so I could throw it. I was still very upset, so I walked along South Street for a bit and then came back. When I returned to our room, Esther was still sleeping. I looked at her and wondered what she really was like. Does she have a boyfriend in Israel? Is she cheating on him? I shook my head, trying to get rid of the dark thoughts. At least she saved my life, and even though I knew she needed my help, she didn't hesitate to risk her life for me. This must mean something. I lay down next to her. Even through the blanket, I felt the warmth of her body, and it was pleasant. Then I realized that I would probably be sleeping alone for a long time. On this sad note, I fell asleep. December 30th. The continental breakfast the motel offered was modest, but it gave us enough energy to continue on our way. Esther told me that her arm felt much better, but when we were ready to leave, I got back behind the wheel. Plus, I knew the way to my home in College Park. It took us another hour and a half to get to Washington, and then we had to drive around half of the Beltway. But when we arrived in College Park, the traffic had eased significantly. With all the University of Maryland students away for Christmas break, the streets were nearly empty. I drove through our neighborhood apprehensively, but when I passed my house, I saw that Ginny had listened to my warning because her car was not parked in the entrance. I drove around the block once and then parked. The inside of the house was a mess, but I ignored it. I didn't need to apologize to Esther for Ginny's untidiness. We turned our formal dining room into a home office, and I took Esther there and started booting up my computer. But before I could log into the NSA network, I heard the key turn in the lock of the front door. "Damn it," I swore. "I told her not to come here." I ran to the door and opened it. Ginny stood there, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Thomas, I'm sorry," she sobbed. Before I could say anything, she was pushed forward into my arms, and as I automatically tried to catch her, a man suddenly appeared from behind the door frame and burst into the house. "What the hell?" I shouted, but then I saw a large black machine gun pointed at me and abruptly fell silent. Esther ran up behind us. "Get back," the man said threateningly, waving his pistol to cover all three. Then he slammed the door shut and looked at us in triumph. "Let me introduce myself. I am Amir Nasir." He pointed at me. "And you must be an unfortunate cuckold," he said mockingly. Then his eyes noticed Esther and his smile widened. "Who is it that we have here?" I assume this is the indomitable Esther Freeman, the Mossad's servant. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Esther tense up and realized that she was about to attack. Amir must have noticed this too because he pointed the gun at her. No, 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 he warned. Don't even think about it. You will die even if you manage to grab my gun. He then unbuttoned his jacket, and we all saw the vest he was wearing underneath. One wrong move, and I'll blow us all up. I'll go to heaven, and you three will go to hell. Esther relaxed her muscles while Ginny and I stood paralyzed with fear. Okay, nerd, Amir said mockingly. Let's see what you learned about our little surprise. With that, he walked into my home office, turned to my computer, and moved the mouse to remove the screensaver. When she disappeared, the NSA network login window appeared on the monitor. Password, he said. Tell it to me. No, I answered decisively. I hoped that ignorance of our progress would give us some advantage. So, the cuckold wants to show that he still has courage, he laughed. I wonder what I'll have to do to convince you to cooperate. Maybe if I kill the Jew. I saw Esther straighten up and realized that she was completely ready to die. But Amir laughed again. No, she is a soldier, and I think you know that all soldiers must be prepared to die sooner or later. I don't think her death will make you cooperate. Suddenly, he pointed the gun at Ginny. What about this one? He asked rhetorically. I wonder if you still have the feelings to want to prevent her death. Amir, Ginny screamed. You can't be serious, not after everything we've done. Amir's face was distorted with contempt and disgust. Shut up. You are nothing to me, just another Western bitch ready to spread her legs and dishonor her husband at the first opportunity. Then he turned to me again and smiled slyly. But I don't think I'll kill her. What if I just disfigure her? Ginny uselessly covered her chest with her hands and began to sob pitifully, but Amir kept looking at me the whole time. Damn it, I was so angry at her for betraying me, but I still didn't want to see her suffer. I couldn't throw away years of protecting her so easily. Okay, I said, don't shoot her. I'll give you the password. Much better, he said, turning from Ginny to the keyboard. What is he like? His hands, I thought. I must grab his hands. Suddenly, I had a crazy idea. If it doesn't work, he'll probably kill me on the spot. But then I thought, he'll probably kill me anyway once he's convinced I can't disable his virus. I don't remember it by heart, I said. I used the product code written on that metal cube on the bookshelf. You really are a nerd, he said disdainfully, picking up the cube and examining it. It was made of flat silver metal measuring about an inch on each side. But that's only half the password, I said, breathing hard. The other half is on the second cube here, I said, pointing to the wooden cabinet behind me. Now his suspicions were fully awakened, and I could almost feel the spot on my chest where his gun was pointed. Pick it up and show it to me slowly, he ordered. Careful not to make any sudden movements, I lifted the cube from the wooden shelf and held it up for him to see. It was identical to the one he was holding. Do you want me to bring it to you? I asked. No, he answered sharply. Put it on the floor and move it towards me with your foot. Carefully. Ginny was still crying and Esther was looking at me with a curious expression as I bent down, placed the cube on the floor, and pushed it towards it with my foot. Now stand back, everyone, he barked. As we moved to the far wall, he placed the gun within reach, crouched down and grabbed the second cube with his right hand, still holding the first in his left. Then he stood up and began to examine them. But to his surprise and ours, his hands seemed to speed up and collide with such force that I heard the bones in his fingers break. Amir screamed in pain and fell to his knees, desperately trying to tear his hands apart. I bumped into him with my shoulder a little awkwardly, knocking him to the floor. Esther was just a moment behind me, and when he fell, she hit him in the head with her knee. She did it again, and Amir lost consciousness. Do you have tape? She screamed. I yanked open one of the desk drawers and took out some duct tape. After a few seconds, we tied Amir's hands, his fingers still trapped between the metal cubes. After Esther had taped his legs, she turned to me, puzzled. What the hell are these cubes? She demanded. I've never seen anything like it. I even blushed. It's kind of a nerd thing. These are neodymium magnets, I said apologetically. These are incredibly strong rare earth magnets. I saw them in a scientific catalog and bought a pair out of curiosity, but I never did anything with them because they scared me. Each one has a pulling force of about 140 pounds. It was the only way I could think of to stop him from blowing up that damn vest. Oh God, no wonder he couldn't get his hands off. I almost feel sorry for him, she exclaimed. I wasn't sure it would work, I admitted, but I felt like I had to try something. Esther said nothing. She just looked at me appraisingly for a long time. At that moment, we heard a loud bang and the door swung open with force. Several men burst into the house with machine guns. FBI, one of them shouted. Everyone on the ground, hands up. It took some time to figure out the situation. Once the agents were finally satisfied that the rest of us were who they said they were, they began focusing on Amir. First, they carefully removed his suicide vest and neutralized him. One of the agents whistled. It would blow up the whole house if he activated it, he said admiringly. Only then did they cut the tape on the terrorist and try to separate his hands. It took 2 agents to tear them apart, and the terrorist woke up from the pain. He quickly grabbed the vest's trigger, only to realize it was gone and helpless. For a moment, he plopped back down in defeat, but then turned his head to stare at Esther and me. You think you have won, but you are wrong. Even if you know what to look for, you are too late to stop what will happen. My life doesn't matter. The caliphate will be reborn again. Al-Andalus, he shouted, and then clenched his teeth in a grin sneer. I heard a slight crack and then smelled bitter almonds. Damn, one of the agents shouted. He took poison. The medic who was examining Amir's hands shouted to his partner. Amyl nitrite quickly. Hold it up to his nose and try to get him to inhale. But Amir began to convulse, and after 2 minutes, he stopped breathing. Cyanide, the medic swore. He must have had a false tooth. The last time I heard of this use was sometime in the 20th century. After Amir was wrapped in a body bag and carried out unceremoniously into the ambulance, another dramatic incident occurred. One of the agents approached Ginny and politely asked, "Are you Virginia Selfridge?" When Ginny nodded, he said, "Mrs. Selfridge, you have been arrested as an accomplice to murder and terrorism." With that, he began to read her Miranda rights while she gasped and protested. No, I had nothing to do with this." "I didn't know he was a terrorist," she screamed, but the agent ignored her protests and calmly handcuffed her. She cried again and turned to me with frightened eyes. "Thomas, help me. You have to do something. Explain to them that I was not part of this." Amir deceived me. I have to admit that at that moment I was enjoying the situation. "Sorry, Ginny, I can't help you. You brought all this on yourself. Next time, be better about choosing who you're going to cheat with." As the agent walked my sobbing wife out the door, I turned to one of the other agents. "Are they really going to bring her in as an accomplice?" I asked. "No," he said. "We know that she is guilty only of stupidity and licentiousness, no offense. But we're going to put her through hell in the coming days to find out everything we can about Amir, his methods, his network, and everything else we can think of. I don't think the new year will start off well for her." Satisfied, I turned and went to Esther. The medic examined her wound. "It'll hurt for a while," he said, "but I don't see any signs of infection, and I don't think it'll cause you any problems once it's completely healed." Then he winked at her, although it was not intended for my eyes, and added, "But if I were you, I'd file a malpractice suit against whoever stitched you up. These are the worst seams I have ever seen." She turned, touched my hand, and smiled slightly. "I'll definitely take note of this." Then her face changed, and she stood up and went to look for the senior agent. When she found him, she asked for an escort to Fort Meade. "Now that we're no longer worried about Amir, we need to tackle Al-Andalus as quickly as possible, and we'll need all the help we can get." Apparently, the senior agent had called ahead and explained what had happened, because when we arrived at NSA headquarters at Fort Meade, we were greeted as honored guests. An armed guard escorted us to a high-security elevator that took us instantly to the top floor. From there, we were taken to the NSA director's office, a place I had never been to and never expected to be in. In addition to the director, we were introduced to high-ranking representatives of the FBI and CIA. I'm so far from my level that I can't even see it from here, I thought to myself. We were asked to recount the events leading up to the present moment. After we finished, others added additional details and new information about the situation. The conclusion was that all three agencies were now convinced that a major terrorist attack, codenamed Al-Andalus, would occur in the near future. Their best guess was New Year's Eve, and the most likely target was somewhere in Israel, although there were other possible targets. Moreover, everyone agreed that the computer virus we were investigating played a key role in this. But after this, there was no agreement, and the group began to argue. At some point, the CIA representative called Esther over, and they both left the director's office. When they returned, Esther had a strange expression on her face. She leaned over and whispered, "I had an interesting phone call. We woke up to the head of Mossad. I am ordered to stay with you and help you in whatever way I can." Before I could respond, the NSA director spoke to me. "Mr. Selfridge, I was told that you are very good at solving such puzzles. I was also told that you have been working on the Al-Andalus virus for some time. Finally, we know that ISIS was so concerned about what you might reveal that it assigned two of its best agents to stop you. For all these reasons, I ask you to assemble a team to decipher this code and prevent its purpose. Any NSA resources you require will be made available upon your request." He paused and nodded towards Esther. "I was also informed that my colleague in Tel Aviv would like Miss Freeman to be part of your team. Is that correct, Miss Freeman?" When Esther nodded, the director stood up. "We still have a lot to do, but I think it would be best if you two get back to working on this virus as quickly as possible." He must have pressed some kind of signal because a man came through the door and led us to a work area on the bottom floor. He pointed to computer terminals and encrypted telephone exchanges and invited us to settle down. "I'll be outside the door if you need anyone or anything," he said. The room we were given was not a normal conference area. On the walls was an array of television screens, each with a label for a city around the world and each with a live news report from that city. Below each screen was a clock showing local time. "Look," Esther pointed out, "it's 5:30 p.m. on the 30th here," she said, "but New Year's Eve has already begun in Israel. If the attack is planned for midnight, we don't have much time." I sat down at the terminal and called up my work on the virus. The code scrolled before me, line by line, page by page. I tried different programs, hoping to disassemble it, but none of my hacking tools worked. I became immersed in work and lost track of time. Someone brought sandwiches, and I took a bite of one, not even knowing what flavor it was. My eyes started to burn, and I laid my head down to rest them for a minute. 31th of December. I woke up to Esther shaking my shoulder. I looked at her confused, but she simply pointed to the clock for Tel Aviv. They showed 13 o'clock, December 31st. Confused, I looked at the other screens and saw that it was 6 a.m. here in Washington. Suddenly, the sound of explosions was heard from one of the television monitors, but when I looked around in panic, I saw that it was coming from a broadcast from New Zealand, not from Israel, and it was fireworks, not sound. And color. Understanding slowly dawned, and I looked at Esther with concern. "It's midnight in Auckland. The new year has already begun there. Time is running out." I looked at the computer monitor, but the code displayed there didn't look any clearer than it did last night. It seemed obvious that the virus was written to infect a proprietary operating system, but I knew that there were thousands, if not millions, of such systems around the world. The only person who could recognize the system code would be someone who works with it regularly. We needed to try something different. I turned to Esther and said, "Perhaps the way to approach this puzzle is to leave the code alone for a while and try to understand what the bad guys want to achieve. If we can guess their target, it may give us a hint on how to attack the code. Let's start with the basics. Bad guys often use viruses to steal account numbers, passwords, or other sensitive data. Stealing a lot of state secrets would create big problems, but I don't see how that would help ISIS. Also, from what I've read, this kind of espionage is only effective if the enemy doesn't know that his security has been compromised. She nodded in agreement. Our people think the same thing. We believe that ISIS wants some kind of grandiose strike, something on the level of September 11th. Okay, let's say they could demolish the tallest building in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. How will this help them revive the caliphate? I asked. If they blew up the Knesset or caused a similar disaster, she said, it would certainly cause shock throughout the country. But this would not weaken the Israeli army, and ISIS must understand that we would respond with everything we have. Certainly these people will not want this. I agree, I said. Another war in the Middle East would be devastating, but so far none of them have ended well for the Arabs, I said. If I were them, my goal would be a knockout blow, something that would take Israel out of the equation completely. Put yourself in their shoes. What could do this? Esther and I played. What if, for a few minutes, then her face went pale. If I were ISIS, I know which target I would choose. Dimona. Nuclear facility in the Negev desert, I asked. Exactly, she said. If they could destroy it, they could turn the state of Israel into another Chernobyl. This scenario was terrifying to me, but Esther seemed to have regained her composure. I can't give details, she said, but this place is protected just like any place in Israel and perhaps in the world. There is no way they could even get close to it, let alone destroy it. At that moment, a live broadcast from Sydney showed fireworks over the iconic Opera House as the Earth continued its inexorable march towards the new year. I started to look away, but then looked back at the stage. The floating fireworks gave me the answer. Patriots, I shouted. The virus is targeting Patriot missiles. I ran to the door of our room and found our contact outside. We need someone from the manufacturer of the Patriot system, I shouted. Bring him here quickly, bring him by plane if necessary. While we were waiting, Esther called Tel Aviv. Most of her conversation was in Hebrew, so I didn't understand what she was saying, but the conversation got quite intense at times. After that, I asked her what happened. Those idiots from the Israeli Defense Forces are confident that their system has not been hacked and everything is fine with Yaholom. What is Yaholom? I asked. That's what we call the Patriot system, she said. They think we're chasing phantoms. I went online and tried to find information about the Patriot system. As I was browsing through various links, the door opened and a young man wearing a Raytheon jacket entered the room. We make the Patriot system, he said lightly. What do you have? I quickly explained our hypothesis and showed him the computer terminal and the virus we had found. He looked at it for a few minutes and the bored expression on his face disappeared. Quickly, he pulled out his laptop from his bag and began checking the lines of code. After a few minutes, he raised his head and said, "Oh shit, what is this?" Esther demanded. "This is bad, very bad," he said. He pointed to his laptop. "This is the operating system of the AMX-65 radar system of the Patriot missile." He pointed to the computer terminal I was using. This virus is written to change the interception data that the radar loads onto the missile. This is a small change, but at the speed and distance required to intercept, it will cause the Patriot to completely miss its target. I turned to Esther. Contact the IDF and tell them we have confirmation that the virus is targeting Patriot missiles. Then have them check the operating systems again to see if they are infected. I turned to the Raytheon engineer. Don't go anywhere, we'll need you. Then I called the principal's office. They connected me right away. Sir, we now have confirmation that the virus is targeting the Patriot missile system. We don't know for sure, but we think the target could be Israel, possibly the Dimona nuclear facility. Yes, sir, our next priority is to try to figure out how to stop him. Esther was also on the phone, and when I hung up, she was looking at me with an angry expression. These idiots finally listened, she said. They have already found signs of the Al-Andalus virus in one of the Patriot installations and are now checking the others. A Raytheon engineer intervened. Oh, they'll definitely find him. All systems are designed to interact with each other. In this way, they create an umbrella of protection. If one of them is infected, you can be sure that all of them are. Esther and I stared at each other. So how do we fix this? I asked him. Well, I've never heard of a virus on one of our systems, but in theory, it should be pretty easy to fix. All you need to do is replace the AMC on each missile system with a new one. Can't you just install a new operating system? I asked. These systems are not like Macs or PCS, he said. Hardware and software are integrated. You have subsystems running throughout the device, and they all work together. The only way to be sure you have a clean system is to replace it. Okay, how long will it take? I asked. Oh, somewhere from 8 to 12 hours. It's too long, said Esther. Of course, this does not take into account delivery time, the engineer continued. Delivery from where? I asked with concern. From our plant in Andover, Massachusetts, he said. I leaned back in my chair and looked at Esther with despair. This won't work, I said. I turned to the Raytheon engineer. You and I have to come up with something else, I said. We worked on the problem for hours. I tried to explain to him how viruses work, and he tried to teach me about the Patriot system. It didn't work out. More software engineers from Raytheon showed up, and I started going back and forth between them, trying to find a way to extract or neutralize the virus. The problem was that their system was proprietary, specific to the Patriot complexes. None of them programmers had ever encountered a virus targeting their system and had no way to attack the problem. The easy, obvious answer for them was to replace the blocks. But this would take too long, and the entire system would have to be shut down during the replacement, leaving what they were protecting defenseless. Essentially, we would be doing the virus's work for ISIS. The first engineer began to get upset. Listen, he said, if you're worried about a missile attack, your best option is to destroy the missiles on the ground before they're launched. Eliminate the immediate threat, and you can safely replace the Patriot fire control system. Esther stood up and came close to him. In the first Gulf War in 1991, the Iraqis fired Scud missiles at Israel, trying to drag us into the war and split the coalition. The coalition diverted dozens of aircraft to hunt for Scuds in an attempt to find and destroy the missiles before they were launched. They largely failed because the missiles were on camouflage trucks, well hidden in the desert. This was over 20 years ago, when rockets were big and bulky. The newest missiles are smaller, harder to detect, and easier to launch. So stop dodging and get back to work. Yes, madam, he swallowed and returned to his monitor while I tried to hide my smile. The situation was tense, but I couldn't help but be impressed by what a force of nature Esther could be. At that moment, she grabbed my hand and pointed to the screen with a live broadcast from Tel Aviv. Midnight, she gasped. Everyone in the room stopped and watched anxiously to see what might happen. Esther leaned over and whispered, "The IDF is at full combat readiness, and I was told that your army is also at a high state of readiness." But the scenes from Tel Aviv showed only the usual New Year's celebrations. Esther was relieved to tell me that there had been no reports of suspicious activity coming from Dimona. After that, the Raytheon guys wanted to go home, but we wouldn't let them go. There is too much at stake, Esther said, and the small group reluctantly returned to work. After a while, one of them raised his head and asked, "Does anyone know what's special about 1.492? I looked at him with a puzzled expression. "Nothing that I can remember. Why do you ask?" "Because this deviation is added by the virus to the guidance data to deflect the missiles," he said. "It just seemed like such a precise number, I thought maybe it had some meaning." One of the other technicians chimed in. 1492, I know what this means. Then, to our surprise, he began to sing a nursery rhyme. In the year 1492, Columbus discovered America. Everyone in the room laughed except Esther, who had a strange expression on her face. She quickly walked over to one of the computers and quickly checked something. "This is it," she screamed. We all looked at her in confusion, so she quickly explained. Everyone knows that King Ferdinand of Spain and Queen Isabella sponsored the expedition of Christopher Columbus in 1492. But most of us in the West have forgotten another important event of 1492. In the same year, the last emir surrendered Granada to Queen Isabella, putting an end to Al-Andalus. Then her face turned pale and she turned back to the computer. "Oh my God, look at this," she gasped. The date of the emir's surrender was the 2nd of January. "Thomas, the attack was never planned for New Year's Eve. It will happen the next day. ISIS wants revenge for that defeat. I'm sure they plan to start their campaign to retake Al-Andalus on the same date." The Raytheon engineers looked at her as if she were speaking Hebrew, but it seemed entirely plausible to me. Esther immediately contacted Tel Aviv, and I asked our contact to take me back to the director's office. After I explained what we had discovered, he nodded thoughtfully. "From what I know about these people, I think you're right. They never forget old grievances and would like more than anything to carry out a coup on the anniversary of that defeat." He started to pick up the phone, but stopped and looked at me. "Now you and your team must figure out a way to stop them." When I returned to our room, the Raytheon engineers were gathered around one of the terminals. They were able to establish a secure connection between Fort Meade and Andover and were now in contact with a test version of the Patriot fire control system. They spent the next few hours trying to find a way to eradicate the virus. But the system's developers never envisioned the need for surgery on the Patriot operating system, and they had no way to isolate the infected areas. "It's like an epidemic," moaned one of the technicians. "It spread throughout the system and got out of control." 1st of January. While we worked feverishly, the new year in Israel passed without incident. Although Esther and I were glad that her prediction was correct, it simply meant that we were even closer to the time when we thought the real attack would begin. Finally, the head of Raytheon's technical team approached me. "We have tested this device multiple times. There are only two options. The first is to disable all infected devices and completely clean their software, including all peripherals. Then download clean software, run them, and test. But this will take a lot of time, and even then we can't be sure that the new download won't be infected somewhere along the way." I shook my head and turned to Esther in disappointment. "We can try that, but I don't think we can complete the job before midnight in Israel. Besides, we don't want to leave Domino's defense system down for that long. What if the attack comes earlier?" She looked depressed, and I felt like a failure. I turned to the Raytheon people. "Can't we try something else, some kind of error-checking method that would recognize the problem and stop the virus?" The poor guy shook his head apologetically. When the system was designed, the possibility of a virus was not taken into account. Now this damn disease has infected the entire system, and we simply don't have an antibiotic to kill it or a vaccine to block it. I started to speak, but the words got stuck in my throat as an idea from the past came to mind. "Smallpox," I exclaimed. When he looked at me with confusion, I continued. "Smallpox is treated with cowpox, a weaker form of the same disease. We can't kill the virus," I said with growing excitement. "But what if we inoculated the system with another virus?" The group looked at me skeptically. "Listen," I said, "we have a virus that infects the Patriot system and causes the production of erroneous target data that is off by exactly +1, 492 degrees. What if we write a second virus just like Al-Andalus, only our version will direct the Patriot to aiming adjustments of -1.492 degrees? Won't they cancel each other out?" The programmers began to argue among themselves, heatedly discussing this idea. After 20 minutes, the head of the group turned to me. "Some of our guys think it could work, but the rest are doubtful. How do we know that two viruses won't cause a big problem? How do we know they can coexist at the same time? We don't even know if we can successfully infect the Patriot system. The second time, we won't have time to properly test." "Look, guys," I said, "we already know that the original virus is very contagious and probably very effective. If we create a virus that is identical to the first one, except for the inserted reverse values, it should work. Besides, what other options do we have?" The discussion continued, but in the end, the group reluctantly agreed that creating an Al-Andalus antivirus was our best chance. They set about building an antivirus, carefully checking and double-checking to make sure that everything but the target values were absolutely identical. While they were working, Esther grabbed my hand and looked at me with worried eyes. "Are you sure this will work, Thomas? If you're wrong?" I looked at her, and suddenly I felt the same emotions I felt in high school when those bullies attacked Ginny. This was what I believed in, and I wasn't going to back down. "This is the right decision," I said decisively. "I'm sure." She looked into my eyes for a moment and then said, "I believe you." The next few hours passed in a blur. Team members tested and double-checked the new antivirus, while others prepared to hand over the code to technicians on the ground in Israel. They, in turn, were preparing to reinfect Patriot systems and then test them to make sure that the antivirus took root. Meanwhile, as midnight approached in Tel Aviv, Esther and I spent time in seemingly endless meetings with dozens of people, all of whom were extremely skeptical of our plan. Finally, we found ourselves back in the director's office where, after a long and sometimes heated debate, he turned to his colleagues from other parts of the government and said, "If anyone else is ready to implement a different solution in the next hour, let's stop talking and let's take action." It was obvious that the others were not satisfied, but they really had no other options. After the meeting ended, the director came up to Esther and me and quietly said, "I hope you know what you're doing for all of our sakes." I didn't have anything to say, so I just nodded, and the director seemed to accept it. He waved to us. "Okay, then, you two have driven this journey to the end. You've earned the right to see it through to the end. Come with me." With these words, he led us to the roof of the building, where a helicopter with its engines running was waiting for us. We climbed on board, and the helicopter immediately took off. I had never flown in a helicopter before and found it quite nerve-wracking, but Esther wasn't bothered at all. It reminded me again how little I knew about her. A few minutes later, I looked out the window and noticed the recognizable shape of our destination, the Pentagon. This week was full of firsts for me. I had never been to the Pentagon before. We soon landed at one of the helipads and were immediately escorted deep into the inner rings of the command center of American military power. An armed guard was waiting at the inconspicuous door, and when we approached, he opened it and invited us inside. The room we entered was a long rectangle. Most of the center was taken up by a large oval table. The seats were positioned to face the huge flat screen that filled the wall at the far end of the room. There were more generals, admirals, and other high-ranking officials sitting around the table than I had ever seen in my life. Esther and I pointed out one of the chairs along the side walls. Across the room, I noticed the director who ordered me to Oak Ridge. He quickly looked away when he saw me looking at him. After a few minutes, the lights were dimmed and everyone turned to face the huge screen. At first, the only light was from the two-time boards at the bottom of the screen. One showed Washington, D.C., the other Tel Aviv. Esther whispered anxiously, "It's almost midnight in Israel." Suddenly, the large screen was filled with a view of the earth from a divine perspective, but I could not understand what I was seeing. Then the screen flickered, and suddenly the same view appeared again, this time with a normal north-south orientation. I saw a line of lights outlining the shores of the ocean and a cluster of lights from other cities. Lines representing national boundaries then appeared on the screen, and circles and names appeared around major cities. I realized that I was looking down from a satellite at a night view of the entire Middle East. Suddenly, the screen enlarged, then enlarged again. Now I could only see the lights of a small town in the desert with the highway passing by it. The inscription read, "Dimona." "Too close," said a voice, and then it seemed as if we were rising through the atmosphere. I could now see the Mediterranean coastline in the northwest corner of the screen and a dark area to the east. "This is the Dead Sea," Esther whispered to me, pointing to the painting. "A little further, please," said the voice, and suddenly we could see all of Israel and parts of its neighbors. "Okay, people, we are approaching 0 hour," said the Dimona-colored voice, and suddenly Esther squeezed my hand tightly. The screen may have looked like some kind of media presentation, but her alarm reminded me that there were real people down there. "Watch the north and northeast," she whispered again. "We think the attack will come from there." "Syria and Iraq?" I asked. She just nodded. The seconds ticked by on the time board, and I noticed that there was not a sound in the room. Finally, when the clock showed 24, I heard a collective gasp. But nothing happened that we could see. The seconds ticked by, and I heard whispered comments. "I told you," I heard someone say, and then Esther's nails dug into my arm. "Over there," she said, pointing to a tiny orange-red arrow rising from the desert north of Israel. Then another one appeared, and another one appeared. At first each seemed almost motionless, but then they began to bend and fly south. More arrows rose from the northeast. "Damn it," someone exclaimed. "Those bastards really did it. There must be more than 24 of them." "Probably Scud D," another voice suggested. Now the flaming arrows passed through Jerusalem and swept over the Dead Sea. Someone had placed a marker with a timer on Dimona, and even to my untrained eye, it was obvious that this was the target. It was like watching a disaster in slow motion. I didn't want to watch, but I was transfixed, unable to look away. Suddenly, more flashes appeared around Dimona, and then more light arrows rose into the air. Time seemed to slow down, and the advancing arrows did not hesitate until I was sure that our antivirus had failed and the Patriots had missed. Then a large yellow flash appeared in the night sky almost directly above Dimona, and almost immediately the darkness was filled with fiery colors that glowed and then seemed to fade away. Then Esther threw herself on my neck and began to kiss me furiously. "You did it! You did it!" she exclaimed. As I hugged her back, I heard applause from the people in the room. Then the voice said, "Situation report from Dimona. One missile has broken through." Esther turned sharply, and we both stared at the screen. The missile appears to have veered off course and struck south of the city. Only minor damage was reported. Even louder applause rang out in the room. I suddenly inhaled sharply and realized that I had been holding my breath all this time. But before I could say anything, a new series of launches appeared on the display, only this time they began inside the state of Israel. "What's happening?" I asked, confused, but when I looked at Esther, she was looking attentively at the screen. "Patriots aren't the only missiles we have," she said, not taking her eyes off the screen. "These are Delilah, land-based cluster munition cruise missiles. Our radar tracked the path of each Scud and calculated the return course. Now we will retaliate." She turned to me and had a wolfish expression on her face. "You didn't think we'd let them attack without retaliation, did you?" As I looked, the signal lights were heading north and east. But this time, I realized there were no Patriots to defend against the impending death. Then I really turned away. I sat quietly in my seat and watched the congratulatory hugs and handshakes in the room. Shortly after that, Esther was called in for a phone call, and that's when I really felt like an outsider. After some time, a military policeman approached me. "Sir, the director of the NSA will be here for some time. He has instructed me to offer you the services of a helicopter to take you and Miss Freeman wherever you wish." Esther returned just then, and the two of us followed our escort through the corridors to the helipad. I thought she would dance with happiness, but she seemed a little depressed. As we boarded the helicopter, she leaned over to the pilot and asked, "Could you take me to Dulles International Airport?" "What's happening?" I asked in surprise. "You know what we say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth," she said with a sullen expression. "The counterattack you saw was tit for tat. Now I've been called to be part of the tit for tat. I'm leaving on the first plane to Tel Aviv tonight." "Oh," I said gloomily, "I thought maybe." She smiled and squeezed my hand. "I'd like to celebrate too, but we can't always choose." The helicopter covered the 25 miles to Dulles in a very short time, and then Esther was gone. She turned to me and took my hands in hers. "You surprised me in many ways, Thomas Selfridge. I will never forget you." She then gave me a quick kiss and left before I could say anything. I was in a strange mood on the way back to College Park. Now that it was all over, the events of the last week seemed unreal, like scenes from a movie that flashed through my mind. The places I've been, the people I've met, the things I've done, none of it seemed real. Part of the problem, I knew, was the way my emotions were swinging back and forth. It was like sleeping under anesthesia, and I could hardly get rid of this state. But when I got home, I had to go in through the side door because there was a sheet of plywood nailed to my broken front door, and the living room was just as messy as the last time I was here. I guess it wasn't a dream, I said to myself ironically. I found something to eat in the refrigerator and then returned to the living room, where I picked up the overturned chair and sat down. Maybe it was just the adrenaline going down, but I started to feel depressed. I looked at my watch and realized it was almost midnight. Damn, Christmas break was over, and I had to be at work tomorrow. I walked back to the bedroom and turned on the light. There were signs of Ginny all around me. Photographs, her clothes, the furniture she chose. I looked at the bed and couldn't help but wonder if she and Amir had. It was too much. I grabbed a blanket and went back into the living room to try to sleep on the couch. January 2nd. The sofa was not very comfortable for sleeping, and I woke up early. But I didn't care because I was eager to see what the Washington Post would write about the ISIS attack. I didn't expect my name to appear in the report, but I couldn't help but hope that there would be at least some mention of the team that developed the antivirus. But there was nothing on the front page, and when I brought the paper inside and looked through it carefully, I couldn't find anything anywhere. How can you keep something like that a secret? I was surprised. I went to work at the usual time, and everything seemed normal. My colleagues showed no signs of being aware of anything unusual. "How was your holiday?" they asked, and I realized that they had no way of knowing what had happened. It was a bit disappointing. Then an hour later, I was called to see Ben's boss. I smiled as I walked in, expecting congratulations and maybe something more, but instead I was met with a frown. He held up a document with my signature. "When you joined the NSA, you signed an oath to protect any information collected while working here. Under Title 18 of the United States Penal Code, disclosure of any information regarding codes or ciphers of the United States or any foreign government, or any information relating to the acquisition or use of any device, apparatus, or apparatus associated with such code, is subject to a fine and/or imprisonment of up to 10 years. This especially applies to the session you observed yesterday and all the events leading up to it. Got it, Selfridge?" When I nodded, he said, "Okay, then you need to get back to work." What a disappointment, I thought as I headed back to my floor. I didn't want a medal, but a little gratitude would be nice. It is now clear that someone has vetoed this whole story. Not only would there be no parades in my honor, but I was beginning to feel like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The depression I had felt the night before returned, and it was made worse by the fact that I had yet another unpleasant task to perform. I went online and started looking for a divorce lawyer. The situation only got worse over the next few weeks. I saw a mention of the FBI, and it reminded me of Agent Henry. I did a Google search and found a little news article buried in the Knoxville News Sentinel. It reported that a federal employee named John Henry had died in a car accident in Frozen Head State Park. He was 37 years old. There were no other details. This made me sad. Henry was a decent man who died trying to protect me. I thought he deserved much more than an abbreviated obituary. I tried to get a little more information at FBI headquarters, but I hit a wall. A few days later, the guy sitting next to me poked his head around the corner. "Hey, have you heard the news? Our boss is getting a nice promotion. Apparently, he accomplished some feat during the holidays and is now receiving his reward." I didn't say anything, but inside I was furious. As far as I knew, the only thing he did to stop ISIS was use me as bait. And now he was rewarded? I thought about contacting the NSA director about what was going on. But before I could explore this path, there was some commotion on Capitol Hill about Israel. The IDF had made some kind of foray into Syria, and many in Congress were outraged by Israeli aggression. When it was revealed that the NSA had handed over certain intercepted communications to the IF, there were howls of protest, and the next moment the director resigned and the NSA had a new leader. There was even talk of delaying Israel's purchase of additional Patriot batteries, but the deal eventually went through. And to add insult to injury, my efforts to divorce Ginny were going nowhere. I was planning to file for divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences, but my lawyer informed me that there is no such ground in Maryland. Treason, desertion, conviction of certain crimes, insanity, cruelty, and evil conduct are grounds for divorce in Maryland, he said. What a disappointment. I had legal grounds for divorcing Ginny, but I couldn't prove infidelity without mentioning classified information, and that would have gotten me into a lot of trouble. Isn't there a way to get a divorce without all this? I asked. You can actually get a no-fault divorce in Maryland, but you have to live separately for at least a year, he said. Meanwhile, you can file for a limited divorce, which will put you in line for a final divorce after a year of separation. So I did, but I was annoyed that I would have to wait so long to be free of her. I also didn't like that I had to pay Ginny temporary spousal support. It didn't seem fair after what she did, but my hands were tied. As spring approached, my mood did not improve. If anything, it got worse. I felt increasingly isolated, both at work and at home. My job no longer brought me any satisfaction. The only really good thing I did became a secret that no one could talk about. It quickly became apparent that management did not like me, and my colleagues began to avoid me. Outside the office, there was a similar situation, but for different reasons. All the friends we made were couples who were used to having fun together. I was the odd one out, and since no one knew the true story of why Ginny and I broke up, I think a lot of people thought it was my fault. As a result, I thought a lot about my life. It felt like every time I tried to do the right thing, I was being punished. I tried to protect Ginny and take care of her. I didn't expect her to idolize me for it, but a little marital fidelity would be nice. Likewise, I didn't want to get caught up in a terrorist plot, but when it happened, I thought I handled it pretty well. I didn't want the Medal of Honor, but it would have been nice to get some recognition. More and more, I began to feel that I was being used. Ginny definitely took advantage of me. All she wanted from me was to support her while she had laser treatment. Well, maybe that was a bit of an exaggeration. I think she really loved me at one time. But this disappeared very quickly when her birthmark was removed and other men began to pay attention to her. It was the same with my job. After I was humiliated by the news that Ginny was cheating, my boss used me as terrorist bait, and now he was being rewarded. In fact, didn't Esther use me too? All she wanted was for me to try to solve the Al-Andalus puzzle. When she got what she needed, she hopped on a plane and flew home before I could say goodbye. I haven't heard a word from her since then. I knew it wasn't entirely fair. After all, Esther saved my life, and she risked hers to do it. However, she wouldn't have done it if she didn't think I could help her. All in all, I'm tired of being used, tired of being married to a cheating wife, and tired of working in a job where I'm not valued. I felt a growing desire to leave everything behind and start over somewhere far away where no one had any claims on me. And when I got there, I vowed to put myself first. I've spent too much of my life trying to do things for other people. Now it's time to do something for yourself. The old me would have been horrified. Don't do anything hasty, I would tell myself. You have obligations to others, I would rationalize. Well, damn it, several times in my life, I've made big, impulsive decisions and things turned out well, even if it looked like no one else would ever know. Now I was about to make another big decision that felt right for me. If someone else doesn't approve of it, don't care about them. December 31st, next year. Cheers came from other people in the bar as we watched fireworks explode over the Oakland Harbor Bridge. I smiled to myself. The scene looked exactly the same as on that screen in the NSA war room a year ago. I had something to celebrate. I basically left everything except my computer, a few personal items, and a bag of clothes, and bought a one-way ticket to Auckland, New Zealand. I chose Auckland for 3 reasons. It was as far as you could go while staying in an English-speaking country. I didn't know anyone there and had no obligations to anyone. And yes, I admit, I was shocked by the beauty of nature in the Lord of the Rings films. Once again, it turned out that I made a very good decision. I found that people in New Zealand were very friendly and welcoming, so I didn't feel as lonely as I expected. I also found a job quickly. I had enough money to live on until I found a job, but I got lucky almost immediately. Ant's banking group had faced a cybersecurity threat shortly before my arrival, and my experience with computer viruses and malware made me very welcome to them. After starting work, I rented a small two-room apartment and began to become a Kiwi. After making the big decision to leave, it took a lot of work to get everything sorted out in Maryland. It's not easy to untie yourself from your old life, but I did it. After I quit my job, made my pension plan transfers, paid my bills, and took care of everything I could do in the short term, I gave my lawyer power of attorney to deal with my biggest problem, Ginny. I told him she could take the house in lieu of child support and left him the rest. The only problem was that Ginny didn't want to accept the inevitable. She refused to cooperate in the divorce process and did everything to delay it. I told my lawyer that under no circumstances should he tell Ginny where I was or how to contact me. This only meant that she started to harass him, and he in turn charged me for all the time he spent on her. After a while, it became clear that I would have to talk to her, whether I liked it or not. Finally, I arranged a Skype session with her. Although she didn't know, I had to get up long before dawn for this call. This did nothing to improve my mood. New Zealand is literally the last stop on the internet, the dead end of the great undersea fiber optic cables that connect the world. This means that connections are often poor and interruptions are common. But somehow we got lucky, and when we finally met, our connection was surprisingly stable. When the connection was established and her face appeared on my computer screen, it shocked me. She still looked beautiful, and her image reminded me of the woman I fell in love with so long ago. This won't be easy, I thought. The call started off poorly. She demanded to know where I was, and when I refused to tell, she alternated between anger and tears. "Why did you run away?" she sobbed. "Why don't you tell me where you are?" I sighed. "Honestly, Ginny, you broke my heart, and I couldn't be around all the places and things that reminded me of you. In the end, I decided that the only thing I could do was move as far away from you." To my surprise, she smiled. "That means you still have feelings for me," she said happily. "Why don't you stop all this nonsense and come back to me?" I tried not to be sarcastic. "Ginny, you cheated on me. You broke your marital vows and had an affair with another man. How can I come back to you after this?" Her face darkened, but then she looked determined. "I know, Thomas, and I'm so ashamed of it, but I was vulnerable." "Why?" I asked. "Why were you vulnerable?" She shook her head as if I was stupid for not understanding. "Well, of course, because I had just had my last laser treatment, and I was still getting used to my new look. When he came up and told me I was beautiful, of course I said it back. This really got to me. 'But I told you you were beautiful,' I said. 'I always thought so from the first time I saw you.' 'Yes, but you said that before I got rid of my birthmark.' He had never seen me before, so his compliments meant a lot more to me," she said happily. I couldn't even find the words to respond to that, but the expression on my face must have made my reaction clear because Ginny's tone suddenly changed and her face darkened. "But I don't want to talk about it. I'm so lonely without you," she sobbed. "Literally not a day has gone by that I haven't cried. I know I did something terrible, and you don't know how many times I've kicked myself for being so stupid and trusting." She paused to wipe her eyes and then continued. "But it's not entirely my fault. I couldn't have known that Amir was some kind of spy trained in seduction. To me, he was just a handsome guy who filled my head with compliments and sweet words. I was infatuated before I knew it. And the thing is, he wasn't even interested in me. He was just using me to find out about you." She blew her nose and added, "That's probably why he always wanted to come to our house." I calmed down. But when I heard this, I got angry again. But before I could say anything, she hurriedly continued. Anyway, I've learned a lot about myself from all of this, Thomas, and I know I'll be a much better wife if you come back. Could you find it in your heart to forgive me? It would make me so happy. That's it. We'll return to the way it was. What do you think, dear? I listened carefully while she spoke. Her appearance was exactly as I remembered, and her voice was the same, but now something had changed. Then I realized what it was. I didn't love her anymore. Ginny, I listened carefully to everything you said, I told her. In all the time you talked, there were two things I didn't hear. You were very clear about what you wanted and how you felt, but you never mentioned me or my feelings, I said. Of course I care about your feelings, she interrupted. I know you were very hurt and upset, and you had every right to be. But if we get back together, I'll spend all my time making amends and— I raised my hand, and she finally realized I wasn't finished. When she fell silent, I continued. There's something else I didn't hear. You said a lot of things, but you never said I love you. She gasped and then blurted out, but of course I love you. That goes without saying. I've always loved you and— Now I interrupted. No, Ginny, love doesn't go without saying. It's not something you say, it's something you show in your actions. It's not only what you do, but also what you don't do. And you don't show your love by cheating with someone else just because he filled your ears with beautiful words. Sorry, Ginny, but this call only convinced me even more that we will never be together. Goodbye, Ginny. I interrupted the connection, leaving her tear-stained face on the screen. It still hurts to lose someone who once meant so much to me, but after what I heard, I knew I did the right thing. December 31st, 2 years later. Earlier in the evening, I had been at a party with friends, but somehow it seemed appropriate to count down to the new year at a bar I found during my first year in New Zealand, the one overlooking Auckland Harbor. Other customers greeted me then, and I felt welcome again as I raised my pint and watched the fireworks. The last 2 years have been good for me. Ginny finally accepted the inevitable and agreed to a divorce. I gave her the house in lieu of further spousal support, and I was now officially a free man. My career was also going well. After a year of working at a bank, I had gained enough of a reputation as a cybersecurity expert to start consulting on my own. Luck played its part again when the National Cybersecurity Center in Wellington approached me for help. It gave me a kind of semi-official endorsement, and now my business was booming. It also helped my application for permanent residency, and I am now officially New Zealander. And thanks to the money earned by my consulting business, I was able to buy a beautiful house overlooking Auckland Harbor. Overall, I was glad that I had made an important decision. They darkened the bar for the fireworks display, so at first I didn't recognize the woman behind me. But when she said, "Happy New Year, Thomas Selfridge," her accent was one I've thought about often over the past 3 years. I turned and hugged her without hesitation. Happy New Year to you too, Esther. A minute later, we parted, and I was able to look at her. Her black cotton sleeveless tank top and tight-fitting jeans clearly showed that she was still in as good shape as the last time I saw her. I could even make out a thin scar on her right shoulder. But this time her dark hair was pulled back under a baseball cap with a long peak pulled low. As she lifted her head to look at the large explosion over the harbor, I saw a black eye patch covering her right eye. The crowd in the bar was loud and getting more and more excited, so I smiled at Esther and leaned close to her ear. "Do you want to go somewhere quieter to talk?" She smiled. "I wish I could." We got into my car, and I drove it from the city center west to Herne Bay. When I arrived at my house, she whistled softly. "You've done really well, Thomas. I'm happy for you." I poured us another glass and took her to the terrace. From there, we had a view of another part of the harbor, but we could see fireworks in the distance. It was still warm despite the sea breeze. Even after 3 years, it seemed strange that the new year came in the summer. After a few minutes, she turned to me and took off her cap. "Well, do you want to ask me about my eye?" Without the cap, I could see a diagonal scar that started under the bandage and ran up through my eyebrow. He left a white line deep in her olive skin. "Tell me what happened," I said. She put her cap back on and sat down on one of my chairs. "Actually, it was my own damn mistake. After I returned to Israel, I was able to find one of the ISIS leaders who was planning the Al-Andalus attack. Unfortunately, I did not find the knife he hid before it was too late." Then she gave me her wolfish smile. "But I can promise you that he will never come up with another plot again." I remembered how she had endured my clumsy attempt to stitch up her arm, and could easily believe that she could endure such a serious injury as this and still deal a mortal blow to her enemy. "Couldn't the doctors?" I gestured to the bandage. She shook her head. "The wound was too severe, and besides, 18 hours passed before I was able to return to my team and be evacuated to the hospital. By then," she shrugged. I thought maybe I should change the subject, so I asked, "Are you still in the Mossad?" From the expression on her face, I knew immediately that I had asked the wrong question. "I was kicked out," she said in clipped, bitter tones. "With a face like that, I could never go undercover again. And because I'm right-handed, my marksmanship was greatly impaired. They offered to find me a desk job elsewhere in the government, but I didn't want it." She fell silent, but I still felt her unhappiness. After a few minutes, she looked at me again. "The last 3 years have been difficult in many ways. I had, well, you could say, a lover in Tel Aviv, and we were talking about something more permanent when I left the service. But when I returned home to recover from the injury, he couldn't accept it. He never talked about it, but he never looked at my face. I guess he wasn't the person I thought he was." I could tell she was trying to downplay the incident, but I could tell from the look on her face that she was still suffering. I sat down next to her and put my arm around her shoulders. We sat in silence for a long time, looking at the city and harbor below. Finally, I asked the question that had been on my mind all along. "How did you find me here in New Zealand?" "I pulled a few threads from old contacts and got on your trail." She smiled at me. "You did a really good job of hiding." I smiled back. "At the time, I just wanted to get as far away from my old life as possible. But I built a new life for myself here, and now this is home." Then I looked at her carefully. "You didn't tell me why you were looking for me." Her face became thoughtful. "You were such a surprise to me, Thomas. When I first met you, I thought you were just a nerd who could work with computer code. But I kept discovering depths in you that I never expected. I saw how you faced danger and dealt with situations that would make most people stumble. I was sorry I had to leave and didn't get to know you better." She fell silent and stared into the darkness. "The other reason is that my time with you, for all its craziness and danger, was better than any time since." She turned to me and had an expression on her face that I didn't recognize at first. "Besides," she said in a hoarse voice, "we still have unfinished business. We never got to celebrate." Suddenly, she pulled my head to hers and kissed me with such passion that we both found it difficult to breathe. I stood up and pulled her to me, and we hugged like drowning people. A minute later, I led her inside and back to my bedroom, both panting and overcome with desire. It took us 3 attempts to extinguish these flames. When I woke up the next morning, dawn was breaking through the windows, casting a reddish light into my bedroom. I felt Esther's body pressed against me, and I smiled, remembering our celebration. I sat down carefully, trying not to wake her. As I did this, I noticed that her eye patch had slipped off her head during the night, and I picked it up curiously. At that moment, she woke up, and when she saw what I was holding, she screamed, "Give it back." She then sat up and snatched the black bandage from my hand. "Do not look at me," she said desperately, turning away and trying to put the bandage back on her mangled, empty eye socket. When she put it back on, she doubled over and began to sob, covering her face with her hands. I hugged her and let her cry. Feeling her trembling, I began to experience emotions that I had not remembered for a long time. This woman saved my life once, I thought, and now I have a chance to save hers. And what was also unexpected was my absolute certainty that this was what I really wanted, not only for her sake, but also for my own sake. I turned her towards me and carefully removed her hands from her face. Then I lifted her blindfold again. "No," she whispered, "I'm so ugly." "You're wrong," I said softly. "You look at your face and see only your eye. I look at you and see a beautiful, brave woman. You see a scar, I see all of you." She looked at me with doubt, which slowly gave way to surprise and hope. Then she threw her arms around my neck and kissed me, and I knew I had made another very good decision. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.